Hello everybody. I'm here at the concourse between the two museums in Golden Gate Park, where I first encountered Tai Chi. And my old Tai Chi teacher, Casey Mao, who passed away some years ago from brain cancer, which must have been really bizarre for him, because he used to talk about how in the West we're all up in our head. Like everyone's like, they want you to move your energy up, and they build giant things that you have to look up to, and you're moving your energy up, whereas in the East your energy sinks down, right? And he was saying, like, watch how children walk. Their energy is way down by the earth, yeah, and they're almost, it's almost like they're walking underground. Like part of them is down in the earth, right? And so they're grounded. And he would always say, never move your energy up. Always move your energy down, and then it will come back up naturally, and let that process happen of its own accord, in its own time, in its own season, in its own way. But never bring your energy up, he would say. And also he would say, just watch the difference between how many or most Asian people, how they walk, right? And how European people walk. You'll see something very different. And he would say, like, if you want to see it more clearly, look more at the elderly people. They will give you a sort of exaggerated example. Yeah. And one of the things that he would say is, like, if you move your energy up all the time, it messes up your heart, and you can get cancer and these kinds of things. So it's very ironic, and must have been quite unfortunate. I wasn't with him when he became sick. I was badly injured, so I didn't find out until later that he had passed away, and the cause we associated with his passing was brain cancer. Huh, one of the tunnels is open. It's weird. Not used to that. So I've had a number of really amazing realizations lately, and I've been working and thinking a lot about some troubling things in the reports of friends and people I love, and also sometimes in my own experience. Transformations in sleep, in dreaming, in motivation, in consciousness, that are very significant, and generally, for those people who fit into the target group I'm pointing at, very troubling, right? Some people are having experiences that are really, really difficult for them to cope with in their sleeping cycles, in their dreaming experience, in their waking experience. And I want to be really clear that I can find examples of anything I want to point at, because in a sense, normative generalizations, what I'll refer to as normative generalizations that compete to incline us to expect a particular sort of behavior or situation or activity as the norm. I'm looking at a little bird I've never seen before. So that's novelty, right? That's abnormal. We use normative generalizations partly to fund the sentinel-like aspects of our consciousness that tell us when something is likely to be going wrong. We use normative generalizations to make predictions and judgments and analyses. So, for example, if I go to a restaurant that I'm familiar with and I order a specific dish that I like, I will notice something about if it's different, right? If they did something slightly different this time, if maybe they put some dried caramelized onions on the top of the yellow curry chicken, and that makes a nice departure from the sort of normative mushiness of the dish because they're crunchy. So normative generalizations, we use them cognitively and emotionally to help us understand whether things are good, whether we are safe, whether we can expect that things will continue to be relatively good, or whether we have to prepare to change our behavior, or even the orienting anchors that we derive our felt sense of comfort, familiarity, complacency, and synchronization with. So we have a relationship with normative generalizations, and it's a very sophisticated one. And it's useful to be aware when we're employing them. Ordinarily, if I do so, I have a purpose. And if I can become aware of the purpose for which I'm employing a normative generalization, then I gain some new degrees of liberty cognitively. If I am unconscious and simply apply the normative generalizations as I am habituated to do, as my exposure to others who do this habituates me to and sort of rewards me for and makes me feel like, well, I'm normal, you know. Our society and our upbringing instills us with a kind of terror of abnormality. We've seen the outsiders. Well, it's sort of weird. We've got cognitive dissonance with abnormality. The wrong kind of abnormal is terrible, and we will be isolated and punished and tortured and maybe put in an institution and so on and so forth. The good kinds of abnormality we refer to as prodigy or creativity. Famous painters, famous artists, famous writers, famous song makers, dancers, performers, actors, directors, producers. That last word is a little complex. So, some kinds of departure from what we consider to be the norm are rewarded generally. Others are punished, and sometimes both things happen. There are rewards and punishments. Anyone who's experienced the sudden onset of unexpected wealth or popularity should realize that those things, while they seem like benefits and blessings, can catastrophically desynchronize or obliterate the context in which one's life with which we've become familiar and to which we are adapted. Yeah? Sudden catastrophic transformations, very few people are going to navigate well in those kinds of situations. And we can train, you know, it's something we can train to do. we can train to increase our resilience and our capacity to maintain balance when destabilizing forces or circumstances are introduced. And most of us have some domain of our lives in which this kind of training goes on relatively naturally. I'm a fan of spinning things and balancing games, for example, and also Tai Chi. And this thing called Tui Shao, or push hands, in which we actually try to learn how to deeply embody our balance and how to feel and relate with the balance of another person in very close physical proximity, to both maintain our own balance and, under certain circumstances, to cause them to lose theirs. It's at least modestly competitive in this way, although I think the underlying framework is one of sensitivity rather than force. Yeah. So the goal of in Tai Chi for Tui Shao is to develop incredible balance and sensitivity, so that if others exert force, they are overwhelmed by having done so, right? So to circle back, we're very familiar with normative generalizations and using them. They're a very common part of the narratives that our culture orbits, and also of the commonly expressed values that we are exposed to in the media, in thought, in conversation with, it was particularly casual conversation with normatively minded others in normative contexts, the grocery store, the gas station, you know. I'm here at this pond. This entire park is formed on top of sand dunes, and underneath the sand dunes there's this incredible system of natural aquifers. And so there are these ponds. I wonder what that was. Oh, that was somebody throwing a rock in. Huh. Yeah, anyway, there's this natural system of aquifers underneath the area, and they have all these ponds that they use to create water pressure that helps them use those aquifers to water this vast, green, beautiful surface that we put on top of sand dunes. Can make it a little hard for trees to stand when the ground becomes moist. Yeah. Now, there's all kinds of, we could talk for hours about norms and normalization and how humans both are so kind of tormented by that, and how they're inspired by it, and how it creates a groundwork from which, you know, upon which we can build and rise beyond that, and how we can use it diagnostically to tell whether there's a problem or an issue that needs attention. I'm sure you can see how that's relevant at the moment with the novel coronavirus and our supercultures both talking about and reacting to what they have identified and the narratives that surround and give those perspectival and perceptual experiences, give them meaning, right? Because raw experience is very empty of description. Yeah? It simply is the experience of whatever that is, like getting wet, or stepping on a rock, or hearing a bird. It's very visceral, right? Raw experience is fundamentally visceral, or at least this is how I think of it, how I'm inclined to think of it, normally. So today I've been thinking a lot about a variety of features of our common experience and how they've transformed recently. And for most of us, for many of us, presuming there's an us, right, that us is a normative generalization. Right? And the we, right, we have blah, 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 that's a normative generalization. And remember earlier I said if we can become conscious, meaning you and me, if I can become conscious, when I'm using those, I will gain new degrees of liberty. And if I remain unconscious when using those, I will similarly lose potential avenues of freedom, right? Degrees of freedom, cognitively, relationally, in my situation with myself and my home and my life path and my relationships and my world and the relationships and so on. So, it's beautiful, it's beautiful, the beauty. It doesn't need a description. It's just beautiful, the beauty. Yeah? It's beautiful here, now. So when I began, I was talking about how I've been wrestling with transformations that some of my friends have reported. And I want to be really clear, if I wanted to find examples of the explicit opposite, right? People who are sleeping like babies, people who are having the best dreams they've ever had, people who are so happy right now that they just feel much better than they've ever felt before. And there's plenty of those people, right? Everyone is unique. The normative generalizations, they cover the statistical average. There are no such people. Every person is as unique as they are an instance of some, description of some class of phenomenon, right? So yeah, we're all human, but we're all very uniquely human. And one of the things I find funny and interesting to think about is we have these stories in our cultures, stories that, well, this is a peculiar topic. I don't want to get too far into it because it's too much fun. But we have stories about what I call the super container, which is the everything. What is the everything? And what is the purpose of the everything? And many of these stories are religions, and one of them is astronomy, and astrophysics, right, is an aspect of the astronomy one. But these stories are something I refer to as skybooks, right? They are books about what is the great everything. And whatever you think the great everything is, all the other little things beneath it, right, acquire or either the qualities and characteristics implicit in the great everything that we have associated with the super container. And that's just one way of thinking of it. I like that word, but there's other metaphors we can use. It's not just containers. There's relationships, there's processes, the super process, right? The super relationship. Whatever we think about the everything determines what we're capable of thinking about all the other little sub things. And so if we keep improving, if we get better and better stories, if we get better and better skybooks and better stories about the super container or the super relationship or the super process, then that improves our capacity for understanding and intelligence, for awareness, for relationships, for being human in our lives. And to the degree those stories are crude or cripplingly malformed or intentionally malformed, everything fucks up for us, right? Because again, all of the sub-stories and sub-relationships and sub-processes, they inherit their essential complexity or simplicity, character and characteristics from the big story, right? And this is the problem with religion and with politics, and even to some degree, as we know from some examples in history, with science. Science is an array of methods. They're not perfect. In difficult situations, they can be crucially important and or necessary. They can help us to survive. They can also get us killed. We can make mistakes in science that get us killed. And also, there's usually costs, because there's not really such a thing as science. That normative generalization, that universalized generalization, when we say science, we're not really referring to one thing the way it sounds like we are. We're actually referring to a bunch of behaviors of individual humans, groups of humans, supercultures, corporations, right? And that's a really messy glob with stuff in it that's just as the deadliest stuff you can possibly imagine and the most amazing stuff you can possibly imagine, pretty much at the same time, right? So that we have this single word, science, to refer to this vast, complicated mess of human behaviors and motivations and activities, it's confusing. It's convenient to have a single word and be able to use that word to refer to that unimaginable mess of things. It's convenient, but it's also misleading. Yeah? Words don't really have the meanings we are commonly used to associating with them. Instead, what happens is humans use words to mean things. And so I am careful to a degree, given the amount of time I have, when I'm speaking with you and with myself in making these videos, and with the future and with people I'll never meet. I'm careful to try to tease apart some of the complexities in our common relationships with ideas and language and knowledge and conception, conceptual thought, models, and to shed light on the places where a modest change or becoming conscious of some of our more habitual behaviors in these domains can grant us new degrees of freedom. An idea I'm kind of borrowing from math or physics, that are otherwise either impossible or extremely unlikely for us to experience. And lately, as I've been wondering about the incredible disruptions that some of my friends and loved ones have reported, and also the incredible positive transformations that some of them have reported, the whole concept, there's like a group of concepts here that I've been orbiting. And one is how narratives restructure memory so that they produce the possibility of different kinds of mental faculties, awareness, behaviors, activities. We can become aware of things that are otherwise impossible if we change our relationships with memory. Similarly, we can become blind to things that are otherwise blatantly obvious if we change our relationships with memory. The same is true of language, conception, authorization, authority. Those two things are really important in human cognition, and particularly in social and relational cognition. If you watch what everyone's doing, actually, there was a normative generalization there. If you watch what many people are doing in social media, they're announcing some narrative as authorized by some emitter of narratives. Yeah? And in a way, they're trying to form a supercontainer around the crisis that we think of as caused by the sudden onset of our awareness of the novel coronavirus and its effects in human bodies. I promise you that whatever is going on is not limited to the novel coronavirus. But it's natural for the humans to try to get a super container around that. And right now, they're really disorganized. And they have the intention to harm one another. In other words, there are shadow actors whose intention it specifically is to seed narratives that will cause populations to attack themselves with stupidity. It's not that easy. I mean, it's not that easy to fail at, right? I mean, humans are made for this kind of thing, especially in our modern situation where technology has produced vast networks, right, that instantaneously transmit thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of little sort of particles of narrative and description and explanation and finger pointing and so on, blame. And that's a really bizarre situation for a human mind to find itself in. There's no time in history when anything like that was even vaguely conceivable. And I think we need to do something about that. I think we need to very intelligently manage our relationships with information, with a combination of good motives and high technology, since that's apparently what we're depending on at the moment. And I have some models for how that could happen. I have this structured model called the knowledge amp. That's a working title for an array of systems that would help us to use technology in ways that were inclined to make us smarter and grant us new degrees of liberty every time we interact with machines and information, rather than doing primarily the opposite, which is most of how the game is being played at the moment. So I think that's an achievable goal, separate topic. What I want to talk about today is that narrative, we use narratives to structure our relationships with memory, meaning, and intelligence. And that process begins in childhood. And part of how I discovered this was a friend of mine, Alan Steinfeld, we were talking about having read a lot of science fiction when we were kids, and he reported to me that at one point in his childhood, he had been forbidden from reading science fiction, and that he felt this was a trauma. And I just thought, that's really weird, that's really interesting, and it came into my mind suddenly that he and I voraciously reading and digesting I read thousands of science fiction stories, actually transformed the substrate of my consciousness and intelligence, right? It catalyzed an array of possibilities that would otherwise not have been. It gave me access to degrees of freedom that otherwise I would be very unlikely to have experienced anything even similar to. And I'm grateful, very grateful for that process. But when I heard him talking, suddenly it clicked. Like a piece fell into place for me. Interesting metaphor. And I realized we use narratives to structure memory, and that's the precursor to what we call minds. And I just want to get this in here because otherwise I'll forget later. My friend was saying with my mind, I blah, 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 blah. And I said, I think you've got it sort of backwards. You think you have a mind. And this is common language. We think I possess a mind. But it's more like we're possessed by minds, right? It's not so much like you're a container that has a mind inside, which is kind of the common narrative, right? It's a bit more like mental states determine what kind of container you can be and for what, right? So that's another important realization. If we change the language, right? If we change the precedents and where we put agency and where we put authority, the resulting transformations are often staggeringly, unexpectedly liberating. And they can also have the other property, right? Put agency in the wrong place, you're in a prison from now on. So we need to be very aware of, in our relationships with language, knowledge, descriptions, explanations, where the agency is placed. So for example, there was an article on Ars Technica last night that the headline was something like, "Can machines write hit songs?" Or make hit songs or something like this. And my immediate response was, machines don't make things. Humans make machines make things. No machine has ever played chess. Machines don't play. Play is the thing that animals do. It's a quality, it's a property where the agency belongs with living beings. Forks don't become intelligent when you apply algorithms, right? Algorithms doesn't make them intelligent, and the humans have to write the algorithms that produce the simulated effect or the analog of something resembling some subset of one or two things intelligence can do, yeah? And of course people will say, well, no, we're talking about artificial general intelligence. And I'm like, yeah, great, good for you. It's still not a property of objects. I would call it something like advanced computational heuristics, but not intelligence. And whatever machines make, you know, those aren't songs. My phone doesn't talk to me. It emits noises that simulate a human speaker. That's not the same as talking. That's not talking, right? And even recordings are not the same as a speaker. And of course, it's hilarious. We call the device that emits the noises a speaker. Isn't that funny? What if that's dangerous? I'm claiming it is. We should be careful. Language is really powerful. It's really strange. It's almost like we're infected with this alien technology we don't understand yet. But together, if we want to, we can learn to. And that's part of why I'm having this conversation with with a computational device in my hand, but, you know, through which I can reach, hopefully, a few others who are similarly interested or intrigued. So I've been thinking about, you know, the sun is going down now, and I've been thinking about how the people who have reported really bad sleep problems and other kinds of health problems and emotional problems and, you know, trouble in their dreaming lives and things like this. I've been thinking a lot about how to understand that. And obviously, it's going to be at least slightly unique in every case. That's why some people aren't particularly troubled, right? They're not having troubled sleep. They're not having bad dreams. Though some people aren't having dreams at all much or aren't remembering them. And some people aren't sleeping much at all or aren't remembering sleeping. So, you know, there's a wide continuum of human experience, but I'm concerned particularly with the people who are struggling. And also with some of my own struggles. And what I realized, along with this realization about narratives and memory and mind states, is that to be human is to be the locus of an unimaginably sophisticated orchestra of synchronies, of synchronizations. You know, we talk about things like our circadian rhythms, but there are 70 different things that we could distinguish in our bodies: metabolic rhythms, our dreaming rhythm, our relational rhythms, our rhythmic experience with light and darkness, our sleep rhythms, our eating rhythms, our conversational rhythms. And many of these depend fundamentally on environmental elements that we are either unconscious about, we have no awareness of them, or we take them for granted. Over the past, say, 100 years, human activity has so disturbed the ecological basis of life on Earth that cascading waves of desynchronizing effect are going to be part of our common human experience, and we will each, you know, we will respond in ways that are both similar to each other and distinct, unique. But I suddenly realized that if we were just to simply desynchronize the aspects that orchestrate harmony to produce consciousness, we would have paranoia, manic depression, schizophrenia, psychosis, wild creativity, prodigy, mania, despair, bipolar disorder, Asperger's syndrome. You know, if you could just, like, maybe these are actually just the different flavors of synchronization and desynchronization of the many contributing elements that produce the light of consciousness, if we use that metaphor. And so, when we experience desynchronization, when fundamental aspects of our human daily experience, whether that's work or our waking and sleeping cycles, our eating behavior, our screen time, it's a weird thing to include, whether we're receiving physical touch or not, and how and when, when the fundamental elements we depend upon as orienting anchors for the synchronization that our bodies and minds, that their health, right, their well-being, is relatively dependent on. And of course, people like Nassim Nicholas Taleb will argue, no, we are anti-fragile. We need to mix that stuff up to gain resilience. That's an interesting argument, and I'm not dismissing it by a long shot. But for some of us, the sudden, unexpected destabilization of biological rhythms, of relational rhythms, of sleep rhythms, of dreaming rhythms, can produce really troubling effects that are terrifying or just miserable, right? Like agonizing. And so one of the things I've been thinking about was the transformation of dreaming. I've heard people say things like, it's like I'm having other people's dreams. Or I'm having situations where there's like an intruder all the time. And there's combat and things like this. And it suddenly occurred to me that the like 7 or 8 different contributors to the experience of dreaming, that the character of dreaming depends on their synchrony, right? When they're synchronized, we have sort of wonderful, amazing, nourishing, nurturing, healing dreaming experience. Although some of these elements must necessarily conflict to produce that, right? There's conflict built into the system. It conflicts with itself. Just as the thumb opposing the fingers gives us, astonishing manipulative capabilities in the hand. So there are, imagine like 7 or 9, some random number, but of factors that contribute to our dreaming. Well, if some of those factors continue on long after the others have quieted, and for example, if the synchronization between our circadian rhythms and the rhythms that emerge as our dreaming experience, if that relationship is disturbed, then we might want to be dreaming at like noon or 1 or 2 p.m. when we're not asleep, right? Because the synchronization has been thrown off. It's desynchronized, yeah? And so we're not getting the dreaming, the deep dreaming experience that is refreshing and renewing in the right part of our sleep cycle. It might be so desynchronized that we want it in the evening, right? When we're not even sort of supposed to be asleep. And then there are other astonishing features of this, like if your body continues dreaming beyond the time when the aspects of your metabolism and rhythms would ordinarily interrupt that process, right, and wake you up. For example, between I think 4 and 6 in the morning, most of us receive a kind of jolt of adrenaline. Although, again, this depends on when your cycle is. And that jolt of adrenaline interrupts our dreaming cycle. And within the dream, that can be perceived as a threat, right? Because it is a threat to the dreaming world. It's going to, the process of closing down the symphony of dreaming has been initiated, yeah? So at those times in the morning, from what I've read, and I'm happy to be corrected if this is incorrect, that's the sort of window for the greatest number of heart attacks. And it's just because that adrenaline drop, right? Boom. And if, for example, we continue dreaming beyond where our bodies and our metabolism and our rhythms ordinarily expect to wake us up, then an aspect of the waking mind can show up in the dreaming world. And that aspect has the essential task, right, of shutting down the dream, right? No matter what. It doesn't care like which part of the dream you're in, whether you're done dreaming or, you know, it doesn't, it's very utilitarian, it's very efficient. You might think of it a little bit like the waking mind's version of the hitman, right? They send him into the dream to shut that shit down. And when that happens, it's usually because there's been desynchronization, right? And so your body's in a desynchronized state. You're dreaming when you need to be awake for one reason or another. Some aspect of your body is aware. And this is often a hypnopompic experience, right? Where you're partly lucid. You're partly aware that this isn't ordinary experience. You know, a friend of mine told me recently of a dream in which essentially an assassin showed up, and she knew that the assassin was there, and the assassin approached her and got onto her bed and pointed a gun at her, and she couldn't scream or talk or really respond. And this is the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? This isn't necessarily the intrusion of a malevolent force. What we're seeing can be understood through the perspective, the toy-like perspective I'm presenting here, of desynchronization. And actually, when you look at what's going on in our cultures right now, there's this astonishing field of discrete desynchronization behavior and experience and conception and so on, right? There's this unimaginably profound constellation of places where we've lost synchrony. And many of those are in our waking lives, but there's always a relationship between that and our fundamental biology. So I wanted to talk some about, just to sort of introduce this topic of the importance of synchronization in our conscious experience, in our metabolism, in our sleep, in our dreaming experience, in our daily lives. And yes, we can certainly learn to adjust, right? We can adjust to new circumstances, we can adjust to the transformations. To some degree, Talib is correct. We can learn, many of us, to benefit from instability, from transformation, from unexpected change. But some of us are going to suffer unexpected consequences that are very difficult to understand and to respond to intelligently, and they can be frightening, especially when we have no way to understand what's causing them, right? And again, as I said, like many of the pivots of identity and meaning and interpretation that we ordinarily depend on have been appended. So a lot of us are struggling to kind of gain our footing in a situation we can't understand at all. And there's this incredible cascade of influx of ambiguity. Am I sick? Am I well? Am I supposed to be asleep or awake? Do I have a job or not? Right? Is there a terrifying disease circulating, or is it just a story? Was it made in a lab? Did it come from nature? Was it the problem with what the humans did? I mean, do our authorities, the institutions we depend upon to guide and authorize the behavior of our supercultures, are fundamentally broken. They have shattered. And when that shit happens, everybody wants to talk about the super container. They want a new narrative, right? They want to build a narrative, and to make matters worse, there are forces that want to fuck up the process of us building a new narrative on purpose so that we can die, right? There are war forces active in the infosphere that are literally trying to convert individuals to infotagious weapons, and succeeding wildly, right? At least in social media, yeah, and probably everywhere else, because even the older people and such who don't participate in social media, they watch the news, Yeah? They want to know what the fuck's going on, quote unquote. And how do you tell what the fuck's going on? Well, you tell because authorities explain it to you. Yeah? Unless you're one of those pioneers who goes out there to find out for yourself, and that doesn't mean adopting some narrative by some exotic side, author or authority. Notice, like, author, authority, authorization, these things all link together in a very important way that underlies the nature of what we're willing to see, believe, what we're capable of thinking or imagining or doing with our minds, our memory, our intelligence, our language, our relationships, our life paths. In every aspect of our human life, authorization and authority are fundamental. And that's partly because our kind of animal is extremely complexly social. We are like dolphins and bonobos and whales. We are like apes and perhaps chimpanzees, and something like ants and wasps and bees too. In fact, our weird relationship with commodities is highly reminiscent of the vastly more benign and beneficial behavior of bees that produce honey from many, many sources. So I think we're undergoing a fundamental disruption in the pivotal orienting anchors that we use to understand meaning, identity, relation, role, but also that we use for seeding our rhythms. And there's a very diverse array of rhythms that have to be mostly in sync for us to feel okay, most of the time, many of us. And a lot of those have been fundamentally disturbed and distorted. And this started way before the virus happened, way before, like, I don't know, 30, 40 years before, and it's been going on in waves that have been growing in intensity and frequency over the time between and there's all kinds of players, right? There's like the cycles of the sun matter for human experience and cognition and life on Earth. There are cycles of terrestrial biological transformation, development, resting, that we've fundamentally just obliterated, right? So that in order to maintain homeostasis for life on Earth, if we understand the Earth as a superorganism, she has to work like 700 times harder just to keep, the dial at like 3 instead of where it used to be at like 78, okay? And as our species and our supercultures and corporations have continued to attack the bases, the foundations of those processes from which all living things derive their rhythm and transform them toward the unsurvivable arrhythmia of mechanism, those consequences have continued to build, and we've continued to, as a species, a normative generalization there, we've continued to ignore that and pretend that, well, more technology will solve that, right? We can just keep making more technology, more technology, more technology. That is the opposite of a solution. And in case it isn't clear, space is catastrophically unfriendly to complex organismal life. We're not going to space. This place is a paradise. We come from here. This is the only place we have. Rather than a mission to Mars, we need a mission to Earth. And we need it 30 years ago. So I want you to be able to think clearly about the things that have to synchronize to produce our sleeping patterns, the relationship between those patterns and our dreaming patterns, what happens if those get desynchronized, what the things that have to properly synchronize and produce harmony so that we have conscious experience that is relatively coherent and enjoyable, or at least not terrifying, right? And just realize that synchronization and desynchronization are topics I will continue to explore with you, but that I want to introduce here to give us some explanatory purchase on some of the things that are happening where people are either suddenly having really different experience of their mind, sleep and dreaming, or they're having much better experience, like they've resynchronized somehow. The elements that have come together to produce coherent experience for them have meshed well. Yeah. Not having to go to the job every day has changed their experience of being human in a way that is enjoyable or exciting or inspiring or energizing. So it's not like just one thing's going on. Everyone's having different experiences in different aspects of their lives. But I suspect that a great many people are suffering, the effects of desynchronization. And having this explanation can help us because if we at least understand that there are many different contributors, right, to our consciousness, our sleep, our metabolism, our dreaming, our physical health, our emotional health, that there are many different instruments in that orchestra, and for us to feel good and whole, and for things to be coherent, requires a fairly significant degree of synchronization across, many different domains of our human essence, our isness as humans. Now, it's also, I want to highlight that if the synchronization of the different forces that produce either consciousness or dreaming, if those things desynchronize enough, we start getting very unusual, possibly frightening, terrifying, or disturbing experiences. And that's just the natural result of desynchronization. Again, this is an explanatory toy that I'm producing. I'm not trying to tell you what is going on. But if we can look at it from this perspective, we can see that it's not necessarily that I'm having a particular form of dreaming experience because there is some bad force attacking me, right? I can be having a dreaming experience that I might interpret that way ordinarily merely from experiencing desynchronization in the contributors that underlie our dreaming. And then I think the other thing I wanted to highlight is just the really interesting relationship between disambiguation and ambiguation. And you've probably heard me, if you've watched my other videos, you've heard me remark on this lately. But one of the things that's happening is like ambiguity is flooding into our waking world experience. And that's stuff that's normally reserved for the dreaming world. So in a way, one could imagine that like the worlds have flipped over, and one of the primary ingredients in our dreaming experience, which is ambiguity, right? That person is like my sister, and when I wake up, I'll think it was my sister, but in the dream, there was more ambiguity than that, right? And that ambiguity represents degrees of liberty in the domain of identity, right? That ambiguity is very valuable. The waking mind doesn't tend to value it enough. But one of the things that's happening, which is unexpected and I think very troubling for many people, because we're not used to having staggering like flows, influxes of ambiguity in our waking life, but that's what's going on right now. And that's partly because, well, there's lots of different ways we can imagine the causes of that. But some of them relate to the breakdown in narrative authorization, and so to then with our relationship with memory. And in case it isn't clear, all this stuff here, this living world is embodied, can be understood as embodied biorelational memory. We are living on a planet made of forms of living biorelational memory. And the possibilities of our human intelligence depend fundamentally on the preservation and health of those forms and the rhythms inherent in their anciently conserved relationships. And those are the most precious treasure on this world. They are not commodities. And for any species that begins to treat them as a commodity, there will be a cascade of repercussions so terrifying as to make the hyperboles of our literature, religious and otherwise, look tame. I love the living beings and recognize them not only as my origin, but as the origin of my mind. Moment to moment, not in history, instant to instant. We are absolutely linked to nature as animals. You change the environment, you change the bases of synchronization for human beings, you change our health, you change what our minds can become, you change us. And I think really what I meant was damage, not change. Yeah? When we explicitly obliterate ecologies, that the consequences of that behavior will very quickly now, right? The ecologies used to be able to absorb that damage to some degree. Those days are gone, right? Now, something very different is happening. The buffering capacity of the anciently conserved ecologies has been shaved down to the bone. And now, when humans, particularly the supercultures and corporations, impose damage on nature, it's going to bounce back very quickly, right? Before we had a little bit of a buffer we could depend on. Now, we're going to see, I think, a very different situation. And it's troubling, and it's tragic, and it's unfortunate. At the same time, we don't want to pretend that something else is going on. The sun is going down. And I know there were a few other topics I wanted to get to in this video. I'm so fascinated by the experience of consciousness and just being conscious at all, and trying to understand more clearly that with which I attempt to understand things at all. And to try to understand dreaming and the changes that are happening, the developmental moment of our humanity together, which is certainly historic and profound. It's a privilege to still have a consciousness capable of encompassing and embracing, and just to embrace and reflect upon the beautiful inheritance and the potentials for embodying that inheritance that not only still remain available to us, but in some ways are so much closer when crisis draws us out from our habitual unconsciousness and shell-like aspect from where we comfortably hide into the light of learning and discovery and intelligence and relation, meaningful relation. And this is one of the great benefits of crisis. I don't take for granted that I can have a glass of water. And when I take a shower, I feel like I'm bathing in liquid gold. And when I see another human being, I know it might be the last time. You know, I am aware of the proximity of death, and that awareness imbues every aspect of my life with a shining essence of meaningful and unpredictable value. So thank you for joining me. And I look forward to learning together sometime very soon. May you be well and free and happy. Bye-bye for now.